Most people move through their days without ever truly deciding how they want to live. They wake up, react to messages, follow routines set years ago, and call it a life. Research shows that a staggering portion of daily behavior, estimates suggest as much as 40%, is not the product of conscious choice at all, but of habit. Automatic patterns run by older, faster regions of the brain, while the conscious mind is elsewhere entirely. This is what it means to sleepwalk through life. You are physically present, but psychologically absent from your own decisions. Studies in cognitive psychology describe this as the difference between the experiencing self and the narrating self. One lives the moment, the other constructs a story about it afterward. When people stop consciously narrating their own lives, they hand the pen to habit, culture, and circumstance. They let other people's expectations and yesterday's routines write today's chapter. This is not weakness, it is neurological efficiency. The brain evolved to conserve energy by automating anything repeated often enough, which is precisely why breaking a pattern feels so uncomfortable. But comfort and growth cannot occupy the same space for long. This leads directly to the second pattern, the brain's deep, almost obsessive prioritization of certainty over growth. Neuroscience has long shown that the brain treats uncertainty as a low-grade threat, activating the same regions associated with physical danger. Ambiguity, in evolutionary terms, once meant vulnerability to predators or environmental hazards. So the nervous system developed a bias toward the known, the predictable, the safe, even when safe means stagnant. This is why so many people stay in relationships, careers, or routines that no longer serve them. It is not that they lack ambition, it is that their brain is quietly negotiating for certainty at the expense of expansion. Research on the psychology of comfort zones shows that people will consistently choose a smaller, guaranteed outcome over a larger, uncertain one, even when the larger outcome carries greater long-term value. This is loss aversion at work, first documented by behavioral economists, and it explains why growth so often requires a conscious override of instinct. The tragedy is that certainty pursued too completely becomes a prison disguised as comfort. Total certainty is ironically boring to the human nervous system. Studies on motivation show that a mix of certainty and uncertainty is what produces the greatest sense of aliveness. Too much predictability, and people report feeling flat, restless, even mildly depressed, even while their external circumstances look fine. This explains why individuals who appear outwardly successful can still feel an unnamed emptiness. They've optimized for safety and eliminated the very uncertainty that makes them feel engaged with their own existence. Waking up begins with recognizing these two forces, the invisible habits steering daily behavior and the nervous system's quiet campaign for certainty. Once a person can see these patterns operating, they are no longer entirely run by them. Awareness itself becomes the first act of consciousness in a life that had been running unexamined on autopilot. Every single day is made up of hundreds of tiny decisions that seem too small to matter. What time to wake up, whether to check a phone first thing, whether to move the body, what to eat, what to think about before falling asleep. Individually, none of these choices feel significant. But research on compounding behavior shows that small actions repeated consistently produce outcomes vastly disproportionate to their apparent size. This is the same principle that governs compound interest in finance, except here the currency is identity, health, and capability. A person who reads for 20 minutes a day doesn't feel smarter after one sitting. And across a decade, that habit produces a fundamentally different mind than the one that started. The reverse is equally true. A pattern of small avoidances, small indulgences, small postponements accumulates into a life that looks nothing like what someone once envisioned for themselves. Not because of one dramatic failure, but because of thousands of unnoticed micro decisions pointed in the wrong direction. Studies on habit formation confirm that the brain does not distinguish much between a small choice and a big one in terms of neurological reinforcement. Every repetition, regardless of size, strengthens a neural pathway and makes the next repetition more automatic. This is precisely why the trajectory of a life is rarely determined by a single dramatic event and almost always determined by the direction of daily compounding. This connects directly to the fourth pattern, which lives even deeper than behavior, the stories people tell themselves about who they are and what they're capable of. The brain does not simply record experience. It constructs narrative, and that narrative becomes self-reinforcing. Cognitive research shows that beliefs function as filters, determining what information a person even notices in their environment. Two people can walk through the identical situation, and one will see evidence of opportunity while the other sees confirmation of limitation, because their existing belief systems are doing the sorting before conscious awareness even gets involved. This is sometimes called confirmation bias, and studies prove it operates largely outside conscious control. People are neurologically wired to seek information that confirms what they already believe and to discount information that contradicts it. This means the internal story someone repeats about themselves, "I am not disciplined, I am not the kind of person who succeeds at this. This is just how I am," isn't a neutral description. It is an active mechanism shaping perception, and over time shaping neurology itself. Neuroplasticity research confirms that repeated thought patterns physically strengthen certain neural circuits, while allowing others to weaken from disuse, meaning the mind quite literally rebuilds itself around whatever story is told most often. Identity, in the sense, isn't fixed. It is a rehearsed narrative reinforced daily by both action and internal language. The person who wants to wake up must therefore look in two directions at once, at the accumulation of small daily choices and at the story running quietly beneath them, because it is the story that decides whether those choices will move someone toward the life they want or simply keep them circling the one they already have. Emotion is often treated as something that simply happens to a person, a mood that arrives unannounced and must be endured until it passes. But research in psychology and neuroscience tells a different story. Emotional states are shaped moment to moment by two controllable inputs, physiology and focus. The body and the mind are in constant conversation, and changing one reliably changes the other. Studies on embodied cognition show that posture, breathing, and movement directly influence hormone levels and mood. A person who slumps breathes shallowly and stays physically still for hours will, with remarkable consistency, begin to feel low regardless of what is actually happening in their life. Conversely, deliberately changing physical state, standing tall, breathing deeply, moving the body with intention has been shown to shift emotional experience within minutes. This isn't willpower, it is biology. The nervous system reads the body's signals as data about the environment, and it responds accordingly. Focus operates the same way. In any given moment, there is more happening in a person's environment and memory than the conscious mind can process, so the brain is forced to filter. What a person consistently focuses on becomes their experienced reality, not because other things aren't happening, but because attention determines what gets registered as meaningful. Research on selective attention confirms that people can be shown the exact same set of circumstances and walk away with entirely different emotional conclusions based purely on where their attention was directed. This means the question, "How do you feel?" is more often than people realize actually answered by the prior question, "What have you been focusing on?" Someone who spends their commute rehearsing every frustration of the day will arrive with a different nervous system than someone who spent that same commute focused on what they're working toward. Neither response is automatic destiny. Both are the downstream effect of a choice, even if that choice was made unconsciously. This understanding reshapes how progress and fulfillment actually work, which is the sixth pattern. There is a common assumption that happiness arrives at the destination, the achieved goal, the reached milestone, the arrival point. But research on motivation and well-being consistently shows the opposite. Fulfillment is generated far more by the sense of forward movement than by the achievement itself. This is sometimes called the progress principle, and studies tracking daily emotional states have found that people report their highest levels of motivation and satisfaction not on the days they accomplish something huge, but on the days they can clearly see they are moving forward, even in small ways. This explains a strange but common experience. The arrival at a long-sought goal often produces a brief spike of satisfaction followed by an unexpected flatness, sometimes called arrival fallacy. The brain, it turns out, is not built for static satisfaction. It is built for growth, for closing the gap between where a person is and where they are capable of going. This is precisely why perfection is such an unreliable target for motivation, while visible, consistent progress is one of the most reliable psychological fuels a person has. Waking up then means recognizing that state can be chosen through physiology and focus, and that momentum, not completion, is what keeps a person engaged with their own life. There is a well-documented gap between how people imagine change happening and how it actually happens. Ask someone what they could accomplish in the next 12 months, and most will underestimate it wildly, picturing only marginal improvement over their current situation. Ask that same person what they could build over 10 years of sustained effort, and they'll usually underestimate that too, but in the opposite direction, imagining something far more modest than what consistent compounding actually produces. Research on long-range goal setting has repeatedly found this asymmetry. People overestimate short-term results because they imagine motivation staying high and obstacles staying absent, and they underestimate long-term results because they fail to account for the exponential nature of compounding skill, compounding relationships, and compounding knowledge. A year feels significant in the moment and negligible in hindsight. A decade feels abstract and unreachable in the moment, yet it is where almost all meaningful transformation actually happens. This miscalibration matters because it shapes behavior. People abandon good habits after a few unremarkable weeks, concluding the approach isn't working, when in reality, they were never positioned to see results on that timeline in the first place. Studies on skill acquisition and expertise confirm that meaningful capability change typically requires sustained effort measured in years, not weeks, which means the frustration people feel at the 1-month mark is usually not evidence of failure. It is evidence of a mismatched timeline expectation. This directly explains why insight alone so rarely produces change, which is the 8th pattern. Most people already know at some level what they should be doing differently. They know they should move their body more, have the difficult conversation, leave the situation that isn't working, or start the project they keep postponing. Yet knowledge sits inert without triggering behavior because understanding and doing are governed by different systems. Research on behavior change shows that intention is a weak predictor of action. The gap between I know I should and I actually did is one of the most consistent findings in the psychology of self-regulation. What separates people who change from people who merely intend to change is not more information. It is the moment a decision gets converted into immediate physical action. Studies on habit formation show that the emotional and neurological significance of a decision is dramatically strengthened when it is followed within minutes, not days, by a concrete first step. A decision made but not acted upon quickly tends to lose intensity, get renegotiated by the very brain patterns it was meant to override, and quietly dissolve back into old behavior. This is why real transformation is rarely described by those who've lived it as a long, gradual slope. It is far more often described as a specific moment, a line clearly drawn followed immediately by a first action, however small, that made the decision real rather than aspirational. A person who says, I've decided to change, but takes no immediate step has not yet decided anything in the neurological sense. They've merely expressed a preference. True decision, backed by instant action, is what interrupts the sleepwalking pattern and replaces it with a different trajectory, one small compounding choice at a time, sustained over the years it actually takes for that trajectory to become undeniable. Human beings are, at their core, social creatures, and no amount of personal achievement fully substitutes for genuine connection. Research in psychology consistently identifies belonging and contribution as fundamental needs, not optional preferences layered on top of survival. Studies on well-being across decades of longitudinal research have found that the quality of a person's relationships is one of the strongest predictors of both life satisfaction and physical health, often outperforming income, career status, or achievement. This finding surprises people who assume that success is primarily an individual pursuit, something built through personal discipline and private effort. But the sleepwalking state is, in many ways, a state of disconnection from one's own body, from one's own choices, and very often from other people. Someone can be surrounded by others and still be profoundly isolated if every interaction stays at the surface, filtered through distraction, performance, or habit rather than genuine presence. Research on attention and relationships shows that the felt quality of connection depends less on the amount of time spent with someone and more on the degree of undivided attention given during that time. This is why a short conversation marked by real presence can feel more meaningful than hours spent in the same room while distracted. Contribution operates alongside connection as a second core need, and it functions almost like an antidote to the emptiness that pure self-focus tends to produce. Studies on motivation and purpose have found that acts of contributing to others, even small ones, activate reward circuitry in the brain in ways that self-directed rewards often don't sustain over time. People who orient part of their energy towards something beyond their own immediate interest report significantly higher and more durable levels of life satisfaction than those focused purely on personal gain. This isn't sentimentality. It is a consistent pattern across psychological research. A life organized entirely around individual achievement tends to produce diminishing emotional returns, while a life that includes genuine contribution to others tends to sustain its emotional value over much longer periods. Waking up from autopilot living then isn't only an internal, private project. It requires reconnecting outward toward people, toward purpose beyond the self, because isolation and pure self-interest are two of the conditions under which unconscious living thrives most easily. This leads to the final and most practical pattern. Waking up is not a single event, but a deliberate, repeatable practice. Research on mindfulness and self-reflection shows that brief, consistent moments of conscious review, pausing to notice what actually happened in a day, what was felt, what was avoided, measurably increase self-awareness over time, disrupting the automatic pilot that otherwise runs unchallenged. Gratitude practices extensively studied in positive psychology have been shown to shift baseline mood and even alter neural activity associated with reward and contentment, essentially retraining the brain's default filter. And vision, a clear, specific, regularly revisited sense of where a person is trying to go, gives the mind a reference point against which today's small decisions can be measured rather than left to drift. None of these practices are dramatic on their own, but it is precisely their unremarkable, repeatable nature that makes them effective, because sleepwalking is itself built from repetition. The only way to interrupt an unconscious pattern reliably is with a conscious one practiced just as consistently. Everything that has been said points toward a single uncomfortable truth. Most people are not living their lives so much as they're running a program written years ago, by circumstance, by habit, by other people's expectations, and by a nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Conserve energy, avoid uncertainty, and repeat whatever has already been repeated enough times to feel automatic. This is not a character flaw. It is not laziness. And it is not a personal failing that separates weak people from strong ones. It is biology operating precisely as designed. Research shows that the brain automates behavior to free up cognitive resources, and that same brain treats uncertainty as a threat to be minimized rather than an opportunity to be explored. Understood this way, sleepwalking through life isn't a rare condition affecting a few unmotivated people. It is the default setting for a mind left unexamined, and it explains why so many people can point to a string of reasonable decisions decade after decade and still not recognize the life those decisions produced. But default is not destiny. Everything covered here converges on one central idea: consciousness itself is the intervention. The moment a person becomes aware of a pattern, whether it is an unconscious habit, a certainty-seeking instinct, a repeated story, or an old belief about identity, that pattern loses some of its automatic grip. Awareness does not instantly dissolve years of neural wiring, but it does something equally important. It reintroduces choice into a system that had been running without it. This is why the process described here does not begin with a 5-year plan or a dramatic reinvention. It begins with noticing the habits that run the day before the day has even been considered. Noticing the pull towards certainty, even when certainty has quietly become a cage. Noticing the story being told on repeat about who someone is and what they're capable of, and asking whether that story is actually true or simply familiar. From that noticing, the compounding principle becomes the engine of change. Nothing here has suggested that transformation requires a single heroic act. In fact, the research points firmly in the opposite direction. It is the daily, unremarkable decisions, the ones too small to feel significant in the moment, that accumulate into an entirely different trajectory over months and years. This is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it means there is no shortcut, no single decision that permanently fixes anything. Liberating because it means the next small choice, whatever it is, matters more than it appears to. A person does not need to overhaul their entire life today. They need only make the next decision slightly more consciously than the last one, and then do that again tomorrow, understanding that the compounding effect of consistency, sustained over the years it actually requires, is where nearly all real change ultimately lives. None of this happens in a purely rational vacuum. Either the body and the state a person occupies moment to moment shape what feels possible, what feels true, and what feels worth pursuing. This is why physiology and focus were treated not as minor details, but as genuine levers of change. A person can alter their emotional state today, not by waiting for circumstances to improve, but by changing how they carry their body and where they direct their attention. This is not positive thinking detached from reality. It is a recognition backed by research that the nervous system responds to input, and that input is far more within a person's control than most people assume. Combined with the understanding that fulfillment comes from visible progress rather than final arrival, this reframes the entire pursuit of a better life. The goal is not to reach some finish line and finally exhale. The goal is to stay in motion, to keep closing the gap between where someone is and where they are capable of going. Because that ongoing motion, not the destination, is what the mind and body are actually built to thrive on. Still insight without action changes nothing, and this may be the most important distinction of all. It is entirely possible to understand every idea presented here, to nod along with the research, to recognize every pattern in one's own life, and still wake up tomorrow running the exact same program. The difference between understanding and transformation is action, taken immediately while the decision is still emotionally alive. A decision that waits until tomorrow tends to quietly renegotiate itself back into the old pattern before tomorrow even arrives. This is why the smallest immediate step taken today carries more weight than the most elaborate plan postponed until conditions feel perfect. Conditions will rarely feel perfect. That too is simply how the mind works. And finally, none of this is meant to happen in isolation. Human beings are wired for connection and for contribution, and a life organized purely around private achievement tends to hollow itself out over time, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside. Waking up in the fullest sense means reconnecting outward as much as inward, extending the same conscious attention given to personal habits and beliefs toward the people who are actually present and towards something larger than immediate self-interest. This is sustained, not by a single dramatic gesture, but by the same kind of small, repeated practice that governs everything else discussed here. A few minutes of honest reflection, a moment of genuine gratitude, a clear picture of where this is all leading, revisited often enough that it cannot be quietly forgotten. None of this requires a perfect person, a perfect plan, or a perfect moment to begin. It requires only the willingness to notice what has been running on autopilot and the decision made today rather than someday to take one small conscious step in a different direction. That is how a sleepwalking life becomes a life fully lived, not through a single awakening, but through the daily